All right, this is James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11. Therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. Brothers and sisters, do not complain about one another so that you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. Brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the Lord's name as an example of the suffering and patience. See, we count as blessed those who have endured. You have heard of Job's endurance and have seen the outcome that the Lord brought about. The Lord is compassionate and merciful.
I'm Phil, one of the pastors here at Christ Fellowship Eastside, and this morning we are going to be looking at the topic of patience. Now, for those of you who are visiting with us, I want to make it very clear we follow a practice of expository preaching, which means we preach through entire books of the Bible, largely sequentially. And so the reason why I'm bringing this passage to you is not because I'm some expert at patience, ready to deliver you something that I have knocked out of the park. In fact, this is a topic that comes very difficult for me, something that is a real struggle. In fact, I would say most church planters like me tend to struggle in the area of patience. It's not something that comes naturally for us. In fact, I would say if you zoom out to even those who are called into missions, most missionaries I know are not very patient people. They are called out to a particular place because they see a desperate need for the gospel. They see a need for gospel advance to happen in a particular place, and so they follow the call of God, not sitting around and waiting, but actively going out and pursuing what God has for them into the place that God has called them. I would say even if you look at the examples of Jesus and the apostles, you don't see people who just sit around all the time. You see people who are going, they're on mission, Jesus driving toward Jerusalem, and you say, well, is that patience? Or maybe our understanding of what patience really is not quite right. Well, thankfully, here in James chapter 5, we get a really full picture of what patience is. In fact, I would say this is probably the most extended treatment of the topic of patience in the entire Bible. So here you go. In these short verses, we're going to be able to see four things about patience. I'm going to preach this passage 4 times. So buckle up. We're going to go from beginning to end, basically 4 times, and see 4 things that James says about patience. Number 1, why we need it. Number 2, what it is. Number 3, what it isn't. Number 4, how we get it. So why we need it, what it is, what it isn't, how we get it. So James lays out 3 reasons for patience when he looks at why we need patience. Number 1, James warns us that without it, we're going to seek vengeance against our enemies. He says in verse 7, therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. You must also be patient. Strengthen your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. He begins this section with this word, therefore, which the standard practice is. When you see the word therefore, you got to see what it's there for. And so when you're looking at verse 7, that means that you got to do the 6-7 thing and go back to verse 6 and see what's going on in verse 6. And that's kind of filled out in verses 1 through 6, where we just heard from Josh last week that it's all about this existential evil that's going on, these very wealthy, rich people that are oppressing the righteous people, oppressing the poor people in this example. And these enemies of God, according to verses 1 through 6, they just seem to be thriving. Everything seems to be working out in their favor. Everything's going okay. And they're going around oppressing others while on their upward climb. And in the face of that, James recognizes that his readers are going to want to respond against that in some way. And so he gives us the therefore. What are we supposed to do in the face of great injustice, great evil? Well, instead of trying to vindicate themselves, James is calling them to trust their cause to the hand of God. This is not an easy thing to do. In fact, there's an entire genre of movies dedicated to doing exactly the opposite of what James is telling us to do. In fact, I would think probably Keanu Reeves, Liam Neeson, probably out of a job if we were practicing these verses consistently. There is something hardwired in all of us that wants to see injustice undone. We want to see answers to the problems around us. We want to see wrongs righted, the guilty punished. If someone kills your dog, you want to take out violence against them. If someone is taken, we want a person with a very particular set of skills to respond to that situation. And I think, it's not just in our movies, but just in our practices, in our politics, whether right-coded or left-coded, there's this sense of like, I see this existential evil out there in the big, broad world, and I want to do something about it. I see the evils of Washington, or I see the evils of Hollywood, or the evils that are happening in different pockets around the globe, and I see that, and it really gets under my skin, and it bothers me. And there are legitimately bad people that I want justice to be served. I want this thing to be made right. And we see these things, and we want a certain outcome toward them. And we're pushed toward a similar sense of impatience that James readers are feeling at this moment. When they're hearing verses 1 through 6, the blood's boiling. They want to do something about this. They want to solve the problem. But what happens when we're called not to address these things with our two fists, with our keyboard? James is calling us to something very different. And I would just encourage this moment for us to think and say, what are the influences that are calling me to resist the call of verses 7 and 8 in my life? What are the social media influences? What are the books that you're reading, the podcasts that you listen to, the cable news that you consume? What are the influences that are indoctrinating your heart and pulling it towards impatience, rather than the influences that pull it toward the kind of patience that James is holding up for us? Now I recognize when I start going down this path, there are going to be all kinds of but what abouts. But what about this monstrous evil? But what about this particular situation? But aren't I right and they are absolutely wrong? James knows it. He's already said these rich people that are oppressing you, they are in the wrong. Therefore be patient. Therefore be patient. We'll get to the but what abouts in a bit. But the question for us remains, am I regularly stirring my heart towards patience with others or impatience toward others? Number 2, James warns us that without patience, we're going to lash out against our community. Verse 9 is a really interesting one, and if you read a lot of the commentators, some of them will just kind of throw up their hands at this moment and say, like, what's going on here? Because we have verse 8, where we're talking about patience, and then verse 9, he suddenly is talking about complaining against other people, and then verse 10, he's back to the theme of patience. Did he just kind of have a lapse of brain space for a moment here? What is the connection? What is the connective tissue between verse 9 and verses 8 and 10 on the other hand? I would say one thing that kind of helps us connect these dots actually comes in the next book of the Bible, the book of 1 Peter. It's a book all about suffering. And all of a sudden, Peter's going along, talking about suffering, and then all of a sudden, he just jumps into marriage and home life. And he's talking about how husbands are supposed to love their wives and how they're supposed to live in community with each other. And you almost go, Peter, why are we talking about this? Like, we're supposed to be talking about suffering. And I think Peter's onto something. I think James is onto something. That those who are having to be patient in times of suffering often become insufferable with other people. That the situation, the crucible that we're in, especially when it comes to the existential, the big evils that are out there, the things that are beyond our reach, we often take and reach out and take out against those who are within our reach. It's the reason why, if you're someone who is just absolutely consumed by the big problems in the world today, the big injustices of the world, I would venture to guess you are someone who also really struggles to stay in close community with your church. You're probably someone who really struggles to stay in connection with your family because the rage that's out there will eventually get directed to those who are close at hand. This is why the abused often are at risk of becoming abusers. We need the grace of patience to be able to avoid becoming the oppressor that we fear. So again, we're caught in the but what abouts. But what about my scenario? But what about my situation? Am I just supposed to grin and bear with the evils of the world, all the problems that are out there? And we'll get to that in a moment, but I do want to give a little hint here from verse 9 that'll keep us at bay. He says, brothers and sisters, do not complain about one another. The word that he uses for complain is a very special word for complain, and it appears at a very particular point all the way back in the Old Testament. And it is at this point in the book of Exodus when the people of God, it says they grumbled before the Lord. They complained before the Lord about their circumstances. And what does God do about their complaint? He comes and answers. He gives them an exodus. He brings them out from under Pharaoh and under Pharaoh's bondage. So in the book of Exodus, complaining seems like a good thing. In the book of James, complaining seems like a bad thing. What's going on with that? Why does James use the exact same word, but in a negative way instead of in a positive way? I think James is trying to get us to something. That in our suffering and in the situations that we find ourselves in, we can often take our complaints and our grumbling and take it to other people. Versus the people of God in the Old Testament take their complaints and their grumbling and they take it to the Lord. So the test for us in this situation is, am I a person who grumbles up or grumbles out? Am I a person who complains up to God and says, do you see what's going on? God, bring justice, solve this situation. Or am I the person who's going around, hey, did you hear what so-and-so did? That's the difference. James calls our attention to it. Number 3, James warns us that without patience, we'll abandon our faith. This point is a little more implicit in the text, verse 11. He says, see, we count as blessed those who have endured. You've heard of Job's endurance and have seen the outcome that the Lord brought about. The Lord is compassionate and merciful. The outcome. What was the outcome of Job's suffering? What was the outcome of Job's trial? We just did a series on the book of Job. Job, at the end of the book, remains righteous. He remains faithful. His faith didn't fail. In spite of Satan's test, in spite of his wife's plea, curse God and die, in spite of his horrible friends, in spite of his own sense of despair and dread that comes up in his soul, he remains faithful to the Lord. He stays with God. He never abandons his faith. Patience enabled him to remain tethered to God amidst the most catastrophic of circumstances. So another test arises then. Are your circumstances things that shake your faith? So we've looked at why we need patience. Next, we need to look at what it is. What is patience? There are 5 marks of patience in this passage. Number 1, patience is something that's pressing. He says, therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient. It's a command. It's an urgent thing to do. Do it, and do it now, he's saying. Pursuing patience is not something to be patient about, something to put off for another day. It's something that you and I need to pursue now. I think for some of us, as I look at particular commands in Scripture, things that we are called to, it's very easy to get to this point where I start to look at myself and I look at the way that I live and go, man, I've just kind of been in this rut for a very long time. And it's gonna just take a lot of effort and a lot of time to get out of this rut, to live a different kind of life. And James is calling us and reminding us, it's never too late to begin pursuing patience. It's never too late to turn around and to pursue a different path in life rather than the path of impatience. Number 2, patience is preventing. The word patience here implies this idea of holding back, of restraining ourselves. It's like me, I love to play with our daughters. We have 4 daughters, and one of the things that they want to do is they want to wrestle with me. And there are a lot of ways I could just like land on top of them and squash one of them, but I don't do that. I hold myself back, and we have a great time. And it's in that restraint that we're able to have fun together. There's so many things where we see this kind of restraint come out that exemplifies this. It's Luke when he's defeated Vader, but he doesn't take the final blow. It's when I was taking a ride with my neighbor, and he's got one of these electric cars, and he can punch it, and that thing goes crazy fast. But he knows not to do that on a lot of these side streets. It's holding back the power that's right there under the hood. If you know that sort of sense, it's that same sort of thing that operates with patience. Patience restrains even the seemingly justified impulse towards self-vindication, toward anger, toward vengeance. Number 3, patience is passing. This was something that jumped out at me. I never would have seen this coming. He says, be patient until the Lord's coming. Do you realize what he's saying there? He's saying, you won't have to do this forever. You realize you and I won't need to be patient anymore when we get to heaven, because it will all be realized. All the things that you have longed for, all the hopes and dreams will suddenly be there. It'll all be done. There will be nothing to look forward to. This is the only fruit of the Spirit that has an expiration date attached to it. Until the Lord's coming. And then you won't need to be patient any longer. Number 4, patience is preparing. He says that we need to, he says, strengthen your hearts in verse 8. Strengthen your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. Patience, long before it becomes that external action we take, has become an internal disposition of our heart, is what he's saying. So patience has to sink down deep inside of us before it becomes something that we exemplify toward other people. And this is really important because when we think of the opposite, when we think of the word impatient, we often think of how people behave, those angry outbursts. We think of the people who can't hold down the job. We think of the people who constantly have to be poking the bear. Those are the impatient people, the people who always have to have an enemy, the people who are always looking for problems. Those are the impatient people. We look at all these external things and say, well, it must be some kind of external flaw. And James is saying, no, it really has to do with an evil heart. Because it's out of the heart that those kinds of impatient actions proceed. And so when we begin to reverse engineer it, what he's talking about, when he uses this language of strengthen our hearts, it's this idea of being anchored, tied down, restrained. It's like every dad goes to Home Depot, you buy the plywood, you put it in the back of the truck, you get out those ratchet straps, you torque those things down, and what do you say? It ain't going anywhere. That's right. It ain't going anywhere. This is what James is getting at. He's saying, but before the trial comes, before the suffering enters into your life, ratchet strap your heart to God's and say, it ain't going anywhere. It's preparing ahead of the trial. It's preparing ahead of the chaos. Patience ratchet straps our hearts to God's. Number 5, patience is pleasing. Points this out. He points to this idea of being blessed. He says, verse 10, we take the prophets who spoke in God's name as an example of suffering and patience. See, we count as blessed those who have endured. This is effectively James is bookending his book. He started in chapter 1, verse 12 with this idea of blessing, and those who are patient are blessed, beatitude type people. And now he ends the book with this reminder, patient people are blessed people. Why does he have to reiterate this twice for us? Why does he really have to drive this home? Because we are prone to assume that the blessed life, the happy life, the satisfied life comes when we are impatient, when we chase after our goals with all of our might, when we deal with the frustrations and chaos of our lives by dealing with it with our own two hands. We seem to think that the route to the satisfied life is going to be the path of self-vindication. But James is telling us, no, happy people are patient people. Okay, by now, you probably have dozens of but what abouts piled up. If you're like me, I often, like, the critical thinking comes in when I'm reading a passage like this. And I'm like, that all sounds all well and good and, very nice ideas, but James doesn't understand my situation. James doesn't understand my family. James doesn't understand the issues of today's culture. He just doesn't get it. All the but whatabouts are piled up. And let's see if James addresses some of these when he talks about what patience isn't. James gives us 3 illustrations in this passage. He gives us the illustration of a farmer, of the prophets, and of Job. And I think each of these illustrations that he uses are really strategic. He's thinking very carefully about these. And so when he gives it to us, he's giving us something that really helps fill out what patience looks like. And when we start to soak in these examples, suddenly we start to say, maybe James does understand all the but whatabouts that knock around in my head when I think about this. First, James shows us that patience isn't passivity when he gives us the example of the farmer. In verses 7 through 8, he says, be patient till the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. He says, farmers have to be patient. And in his culture, in the southern hemisphere, he says there are these rains that you all know, they come in the September-October time frame, the April-May time frame, and in the in-between, you gotta wait. You don't see the clouds in the sky, you don't see the rain coming down, and it becomes really difficult. So what do farmers do in the in-between? This is where I'll offer you the parable of the 5 farmers. Once upon a time, there were 5 farmers gathered around a campfire at night. And they were telling stories and having a good time, and then a voice spoke to them from heaven. And God called them and said, I want you all to be my farmers. I want you to be Christian farmers. And so if you do so, I will bless your crops. And farmer number 1 had seen his dad struggle for many years, and he had seen the difficulty of the journey. He had seen those months and months of dry times where there was no food on the table. And he said, I don't want that for my life. I don't want that for my kids. I'm not doing that. In fact, I'm going to go and be a fisherman because I know that I can throw my line into the water and I can pull out a fish and I can eat today. I don't have to wait months and months. I can provide for my family. So he disregards what God had told him to do. He ignores the voice of God and becomes a fisherman. The second farmer went home, and he said, it's all well and good. I've always wanted to be a farmer, and I'm just going to work really hard at this. He thinks nothing about the God who called him to the task. He doesn't pray and talk to God about this. It's just a job for him now. And so he puts himself into it. He throws himself into the work. The whole season, he's working hard and trying to produce these crops by himself. He does everything in his mind that he needs to do to make some crops thrive. And at the end of the season, there's no crops. And he's angry. This comes from this legalistic heart that expects God to save us and then just leave us to do the rest on our own. And we just follow the rules with no mindfulness of our relationship with him. And everything is just supposed to work out great. This is the demanding farmer. The third man went home, and he thought a lot about the God who had called him to the work. And he had this aspect of, I'm going to really spend a lot of time praying for God to bless my fields. And so he spends a lot of time in prayer and reflection, and he walks by. He's going to let go and let God when it comes to his crops. And so he walks by that field every day. He prays, God, would you please bless these crops? Will you please make it grow? There's no seed in the ground. There's no weeds being pulled up. But surely God's going to be good, and God's going to bless, and God's going to produce the fruit. Day after day, he goes on throughout the whole season, and nothing arrives. He's completely passive in his effort. This is the dreaming farmer. The fourth farmer did something that was kind of split the difference between the dreamer and the demander. He's going to do his half and expect that God is going to do his half. And so he gets into the early part of the seasons, the first rains come, and it seems like God must be blessing. I'm doing my work, I'm putting the seeds in the ground. But then the dry season comes. and he's working. And he's really, digging out the trenches and trying to expect these rains to come, and there's no rains coming, month after month after month. And halfway through, in between the early and the late rains, he quits the job. He walks off the field. Because he's expecting, if I do my 50%, God will put in his 50%. I'm holding up my end of the bargain. God's not holding up his end of the bargain. And we get discouraged. And then there is a fifth farmer. He goes home and he recognizes that God is calling him to a very difficult task. And so he works at it and he prays at it. Every step of the way is bathed not only in his effort, but in his prayer, his calling out to God. At every stage, the development of the shoots, the growth of the vines, the budding of the fruit, the flourishing of the fruit, the harvesting of the fruit, he prays that God would bring the blessing. And when God does, he thanks God for the results. He labors and he works, praying and trusting until finally the harvest is brought in. And what does he do? Does he say, I did it? No. Even if I had done everything, it would be nothing if God didn't come. It'd be nothing if God didn't bless it. It'd be nothing if God didn't bring the rain. Everything would be a failure if it weren't for God. He cultivates in his own heart the aspect that the Apostle Paul talks about when he says, I worked harder than the rest, but yet, not I, but Christ in me. He recognizes that if this were all up to me, if this were all my strength, my doing, my ability, it'd be nothing. It would all fall flat on its face. It has to be of God. It has to be his work. That doesn't absolve me of the responsibility I have to go out into the field. But it's all of grace. It's all of God at the end of the day. Why is this parable important for us? I share it because so long as you and I are caught between the first and second rains, so long as you and I are caught between the first and second comings of Christ, so long as we're caught 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot on earth, 1 foot in eternity, 1 foot in east side, we need to cultivate this attitude of patient obedience. We must live lives without passivity. And the devoted farmer gives us this example of somebody who is 100% trusting in God while 100% throwing himself into the effort. This is what stands out as the example that James brings to bear for us as this farmer in the midst of the rains. Number 2, patience isn't pacifism. In verse 10, we're giving the example of the prophets. It says, who spoke in the Lord's name. Spoke in the Lord's name. The prophets, in their patience, didn't just sit idly by, watching for the bad things to unfold in the culture around them. They spoke to it. They addressed the evil that surrounded them. They did something. They weren't pacifists. They weren't sitting idly by. But notice how James talks about it. He says they spoke in the Lord's name. When you speak in the Lord's name, you speak with 2 things. You speak with boldness and with caution. How does that work together? You're bold because I don't want to say less than what God has said. You're cautious because I don't want to say more than what God has said. And that's the prophetic edge that pierces into the culture, pierces into the darkness. The prophets exemplify for us a third way of sorts. As believers in a dark world, in the midst of a secular age, we are pulled in some really dark directions. There's a direction toward pacifism that would say, hey, just shut up. Don't talk about God. Don't talk about the Word of God. Keep your Christianity out of the public square. That's something that's private for you, for your family, but don't take that to work. Peace at all costs. But then there's a pull toward activism. And that's the pull to get angrier and angrier about, how Christians are getting sidelined. More vitriolic with those who disagree with us. There would be even some who would say, there was a time to try to persuade people. There was a time to exercise peace, patience, humility, meekness. There was a time for that, maybe back in the 80s or in the 90s, when people liked Christians, but now people hate Christians. And so a different playbook is on order. We live in a negative world where it calls for strife, for impatience, for slander, for assertiveness. That's what's got to rule the day. But the prophets model a different path. Prophets show us bold and cautious patience. Patience without pacifism. And third, patience isn't perfectionism. I tell you, this one lands close with me and is really encouraging. James' final illustration, verse 11, he doesn't give us, be patient like Jesus, because that'd be incredible. He lowers the bar one notch lower. He says, be patient like Job. Think about Job for a minute. It's like we've been through this study on Job. And I love that he pulls this guy in because, Job is remarkably patient, yet he doesn't get it right 100% of the time. He's a guy who despises the day of his birth. He presses God for answers. He asserts his own righteousness. He does pretty well, but even at the end of the book, God rebukes Job. He brings a rebuke against Job. You realize that? He's not a perfect sufferer. He's not perfectly patient. Job shows us the imperfect path toward patience, this long haul fruit of his life. That at the end of the day, he was patient, but it wasn't without its bumps and bruises along the way. It wasn't Instagram-worthy patience. This was rather raw and ugly and unfiltered patience, but patience nonetheless. And so I appreciate that James holds up for us the example of Job. He's the real deal, warts and all. So we've seen why we need patience, what it is, what it isn't, hopefully address some of the but what abouts that hover around this practice of patience. But one final thing, one but what about hangs with me most closely, because even Job, even leveling, notching the bar down a little bit, I look at that and go, man, how unrealistic. Like, how do I cultivate Job-like patience? That's crazy, right? That's so extreme. But there's good news for us. Those of us who are indwelled by the Holy Spirit, those of us who have been redeemed by Jesus, to practice this life of patience. There really is a possibility for us to find this. Even those of us who are caught between the early and the late rains, those of us who are in that dry season, waiting for God to do something. Those of us who find ourselves in, like the prophets, in an Isaiah-like slog, waiting for results, waiting for God to do something and trying to be active in that space. Those of us who find ourselves like Job, hit and miss in the midst of our trials. The good news for us is found in the gospel. James gives us here kind of the contours of the gospel story. The gospel really has three defining elements. The bad news, which is the problem. The problem is that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. All humanity is under God's wrath and under God's judgment. That God has every right to look at all of us and to condemn us for an eternity apart from him in everlasting punishment. There is a problem that the world's destiny has fallen under the judgment and wrath of God. Number two, there is an announcement that the judge, instead of remaining away from us and dropping his gavel from the skies, has actually come near to us, has entered into our world, has come close to us. And then number three, that has resulted in the unthinkable, that the judge who came near to us didn't drop the gavel on us, but dropped the gavel on himself, with the result that his mercy and his compassion free us from the consequences that are rightfully ours. James knows this story, and James shows us how that story redefines how we think about patience altogether. Because patience is possible because Jesus controls the world's destiny. There is the problem of the world that surround us. There is evil and sin everywhere we look. There is great systemic injustice. There is great existential evil in the world around us. And we see it everywhere we look. And the gospel reminds us that Jesus has come to put an end to that. That there is one day coming when the judge of all the earth will put everything to rights again. We can turn our back on the path of self-vindication, this frustration that we want to lob at others. Why? Not just to pass over it and put on our Pollyanna glasses and just kind of move through it and just assume everything's going to be good. No, we can move through this with patience because we know we're not the judge. There is someone who will deal with the great injustice of this world. There is someone who will deal with the things that have hurt us so deeply. There is one judge, and it's not me. And I'm free from needing to be the judge myself. We can renounce the desire for revenge because every passing day brings us closer and closer and closer to the day when he will judge. He will vindicate. And number two, patience is possible because Jesus breaks in on history. Notice how many times he says, the Lord's coming is near. He says the judge is at the door. When you realize that there's someone who's coming to your house, it's standing right outside the door, it changes how you respond. He's saying, recognize that. This ought to be a great comfort to those who are being patient, that the one who broke into history once will break in again someday. And he will come. And he's come to be near to those who are patient. He's come to bring justice to the evil, but he's also near at the door to hear our grievances, even when we air it to him. And number three, patience is possible because Jesus gives lavish mercy. There is almost, even some folks have kind of said, what do I do with this bit at the end of verse 11? Is this almost this throwaway bit, the Lord is compassionate and merciful? Like, is James just kind of saying some nice thing about God here at the very end of this passage, or is it really tethered to what he's been talking about? Is it possible that in order to live a life of patience, I have to really, truly believe that Jesus is compassionate and merciful to me? Is it possible that I cannot avoid impatience unless I really, truly have come to grips with the fact that Jesus has extended patience toward my impatient heart? For all the times that I have been impatient and lashed out at others, he doesn't lash out at me. He doesn't reject me. He doesn't push me away. See, this is the very heart of the gospel, that Jesus himself endured incredible evil. There was no greater evil or injustice that could ever be done against a person or has ever been done in history than what was poured out on Jesus at the cross. The injustice that he received was unthinkable. And instead of lashing out in impatience, he patiently endures it. And why does he do it? He does it for you and for me. His patience for my impatience. His resignation of self-vindication for all the times I've taken vengeance. He does that for you and for me. He takes our place at the cross. He goes down in defeat so that we can rise in victory. He does the unthinkable for us. His patience is for us. And it's in my view of that, as I see that Jesus patiently endures gross injustice, that suddenly I'm empowered to pursue a patient life with other people. How could I not pursue patience when he has been so patient and merciful and compassionate to me? See, all of this is grounded in the work of Jesus Christ on our behalf. It's mercy that calls to us, that there is hope for your impatient heart and for mine.